Say, so I'm going to turn it over to Christian. So please welcome Christian Parenti.
Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to be back on the West Coast. I lived out in San Francisco for a number of years, and I moved back to Brooklyn recently. But the West Coast is really a good place. So I'm gonna read from this book tonight. I'm not gonna give you a talk. I'm gonna read, and but then I'll answer your questions afterwards. The book is The Freedom. It's based on these 3 trips that I made to Iraq for The Nation magazine. I spent about 4 months there total. I first went in August 2003, and then went back in December, January 2003, 2004, and then most recently in June and July of 2004. And so it's a chronicle of the disintegration of this occupation. And it's different from other things I've written because it's not, as David mentioned, I sort of have one foot in academia, or did, and one foot in journalism. And this, to some extent, marks my taking a foot out of academia. So, in other words, it's more descriptive and narrative because, to some extent, there's so little that needs to be analyzed about Iraq. It's so blatant. So, I'll just read to you, and then I'll answer your questions. So, this first bit, and thanks to the bookstore, and thanks to David Hyde and everyone else who helped organize this, I really appreciate it. So the first bit is about heading into Iraq. It's actually not the first time that I headed into Iraq. It's actually from, the book sort of begins with the second trip in, second of 3 trips. And the way you get into Iraq, well, now you have to fly in, but the way we used to get in was you drive from Amman, Jordan into Baghdad. But now that road's completely closed by combat, so you have to fly in, which is, you fly into this huge military base, and they spiral down so you don't get shot, and then you drive, you just like run the gauntlet up into Baghdad. So, at a gas station deep in the desiccated wastes of western Iraq, a producer for Fox TV waits to meet his armed and flak-jacketed security entourage. The producer is a man in his 50s named Frank, of medium height, good-looking, fit, with closely cropped gray hair. He was in Vietnam with the U.S. military, then went straight into television and spent the next 30 years in the business. Friendly and confident, Frank wears just the right clothes: khaki cargo pants, charcoal fleece pullover, Gore-Tex windbreaker. He scans the lunar landscape and announces, "I think we're going to have it all wrapped up by March." It's December 2003, and Frank is talking about the chaotic little war gripping Iraq's so-called Sunni Triangle. This oil-stained refueling depot on Iraq's main east-west highway is the war's front gate. Beyond here, things begin to get hot, with thieving Alibabas and the armed resistance preying on civilian traffic and military convoys alike. Usually the anonymous gunmen are content just to loot the gear of TV journalists or empty the wallets of Iraqi and Jordanian sojourners, but sometimes it gets worse. About the time I met Frank, 2 contractors were gunned down. Then a CNN crew was fired on, leaving 2 dead and 2 wounded. Then an Arab news crew working for Reuters was stopped by resistance fighters just outside Fallujah. Forced to lie face down on the ground with guns to their heads and accused of being U.S. collaborators, the reporters barely survived. They had committed the sin of chatting with American troops at a checkpoint. Quick talking and perhaps a little help from Allah got them back to Baghdad, shaken but alive. After 1 year of occupation, the birthplace of civilization lies in ruins, occupied, violent, corrupt, impoverished, chaotic, mildly radioactive, and stalked by the gathering storm of religious fundamentalism and irredentist nationalism and criminal mayhem. Frank from Fox TV looks out at the desert and sees little of this. Instead, he apprehends a political mirage, the idea of American imperial beneficence and competence. For him, the conquest of Iraq, the war, the chaos, the Bush administration's ambitious and openly stated plans for global control are all part of an exciting drama in which the American national character is being put to the test. As in a movie, this narrative has a clear structure. The initial challenge, the first easy victory, then the dramatic setback, the moment of doubt, followed by recovery, renewed resolve, and the inevitable final victory. For a moment, I can almost see it too, reflected in Frank's slightly mirrored sunglasses and in that friendly American smile that invites me, his countrymen, to join in and feel good, feel optimistic, feel noble, feel like a winner. But shift focus back from the screen above the empty horizon onto the more immediate surroundings, and the narrative begins to unravel. The Iraq that I found during parts of 2003 and 2004 was more like a half-repressed memory of abuse than a drama of hope and redemption. This mess was the joint product of Saddam Hussein's despotism and the U.S. conquest, the final phase of a long, slow-boiling war that started in 1991 with Operation Desert Storm, continued under the Clinton-era regime of sanctions and occasional bombings, and moved into completion when the armies of George W. Bush marched on Baghdad. The whole idea here is to get you guys enticed so you buy the book and get it for all your relatives. So, okay, good, glad. All right, so the next scene is a little further in here. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to give you a little, give you a sampling of, sometimes I read stuff that's just like bang, bang, adrenaline, then we duck the bullets kind of crap. But what I'm trying to give you is a little smattering of the whole flavor, because mostly it's not bang, bang. But the next little section is a little bit of bang, bang here. A thick plume of black smoke rises from a section of Karata Street, where U.S. military patrols often stop to buy air conditioners and DVDs. An American Humvee making just such a stop has parked on a wide traffic median and been blown to pieces by a remote-activated improvised explosive device, or IED, buried in a dirt planting square. By total chance, my three friends and I are the first press on the scene. Behind us come two guys from the Kent News and Pictures. Most journalists are busy elsewhere. They have a better story on the other side of town, where the Jordanian embassy has just been hit with a massive car bomb, the first of many to follow. The entire international press corps has been on the perimeter of that mess for about 2 hours. We heard the news of the embassy bombing late, and we were finally headed there when we saw this other column of smoke rising close behind us in our rearview mirror. I made 3 trips to Iraq, sometimes alone, sometimes with people, and then sometimes hooked up with people that I knew there. This one trip I went with a guy named Scott Fleming, who's actually a lawyer in the Bay Area, and a guy named Garrett Scott, who made a movie called Cul-de-sac, about someone who stole a tank in San Diego. It's a great movie you should check out. And then he's made another movie that I helped him shoot, to some extent, I'm proud to say, in Fallujah, where he embedded, we both embedded with the 82nd Airborne, and it's sort of like this sort of picture of daily life for a squad of soldiers fighting in Fallujah. So it's called Occupation Dreamland. And it doesn't have a distributor yet, but it's just got into the Rotterdam Film Festival, and it's a great film, and it's going to be around. So anyway, so I'm traveling with this guy Scott Fleming, and Garrett Scott, and my my translator, who in the book I call Akil, but whose real name is Ahmed. And the title, I should just sort of interrupt myself and tell you, sort of comes from the freedom. Is a term that I heard often from Iraqis when they would refer bitterly and ironically to the sort of the chaos around them and say, oh, look, the freedom. Thank you so much for the freedom. And in Arabic, when you say freedom, you actually say the freedom. You say al-hurriya. You don't say hurriya. You say al-hurriya. So when they would translate, they would say the freedom. And it basically was this ironic way of saying, look at all this crap that you've delivered us. So anyway, these are the people I'm with. So anyway, we're driving along. We heard the news of the embassy bombing late. We were finally headed there when we saw this other column of smoke rising behind us in our rearview mirror. Turn around, Fleming demands. That's not a trash fire. We bail out and jog towards the smoke. Carrata Street is empty and totally quiet, except for the shopkeepers who huddle in their doorways and occasionally call out to us in Arabic and English, "Be careful." We move to the side of the streets and creep along past the stores, staying low and near the cover of the parked cars. Then we get close enough to see what's going on. About 20 feet away sit a military transport truck and 2 Humvees with a handful of American soldiers crouched behind them. 30 feet beyond that are the flaming remains of a 3rd Humvee, blown to smithereens by the massive IED. Bizarrely, there's no firing, no yelling, no talking, no radio traffic, no one screaming, but 2 U.S. soldiers are down. They've been pulled into one of the vehicles, ready for evacuation. So far, there are no reinforcements or helicopters overhead. All one can hear is the billowing updraft of the flame and the smoke from the obliterated Humvee. We crouch and watch, feeling slightly scared and slightly silly. Scared because we can see this really is war. Silly because we all know how to act, or think we know how to act, thanks to childhoods full of war movies. Then it starts. At first, a few loud pops and cracks, then a cacophonous barrage. It's hard to tell what's happening, but it seems that the ammunition in the burning Humvee is exploding, and the troops in the streets are firing, and someone in the upper floors of a 3-story office mall is shooting back at them. Later, I meet a CPA-connected aid worker who was chance shopping for an air conditioner and got pinned down in a store just across from the Humvee. He reported that the shooting began when GIs taking up position in that same shop saw an armed man on the roof across the street. As soon as the storm of lead starts, Fleming and I are behind a small Toyota sedan. I try to merge with the rear wheel to keep as much metal as possible between me and the madness a few yards away. The shooting subsides. We consider our options. Stay here, go to that shop. This engine block is pretty solid, yeah, and half our bodies are behind rubber tires. We move to the doorway of a shop. Another round of blasting commences. We hit the ground, pressing our bodies into the dusty concrete. After a moment, it's quiet again. Garrett and Akil have crossed the street. Fleming and I look at the angle of things and figure it's best to be on the same side of the street as the U.S. troops who have most of the guns and are doing most of the shooting. We cross over, walking quickly but not running, as if the firefight is a big dog that has to be psyched out. The 4 of us take up position in the doorway of a refrigerator store next to another that sells shoes. Now armored personnel carriers arrive, disgorging scores of soldiers from the 82nd Airborne. The firing continues, and occasionally we hear a few return rounds. They pass with the sound of hot razors slashing open the air above our heads. Zick! The really close rounds sound like loud cracks. That's Kalishnikov, I know the voice, says Akil. There's a clear bit of national pride in his tone. His countrymen are fighting back. Never mind that we are now mixed in with the most forward U.S. troops and getting shot at. He and Garrett are cool and collected, rolling video and sound with total equanimity. Fleming and I are a bit less collected. During some of the loudest and most crowded blasts of 50 cals and M4s and answering AK-47s, I lose my nerve completely and duck from the doorway deep into the back of the electronics shop. The 2 shopkeepers are equally freaked out but still very polite. The owner, Ali, offers me water. We make simple conversation in an improvised pidgin of Arabic and English and fear. War bad, la la war, no fucking good. Nam, la la war, inshallah salam salam Iraq. In Iraq, peace, God willing, inshallah, inshallah. The firefight goes on for about 2 hours. And about halfway through the fight, we start moving down toward the targeted building as U.S. troops start moving past us. The whole action is slow and methodical. In many ways, it encapsulates the larger dynamic of the war, confusing and labor-intensive, overly and dysfunctionally technological, awkwardly urban. The U.S. troops have more firepower than they can use, but they don't know exactly where or who the enemy is. There are civilians hiding in every corner. The ground floor of the targeted building is full of merchants and shoppers. An undisciplined fire will mean scores of civilians dead. There are 2 GIs down. I can't see them, but I'm told that one has lost his legs and is probably set to die. Then a medevac helicopter arrives just overhead. It, too, like much of the military's technology, is foiled. The street is crisscrossed with electrical wires, and there's no way the chopper can land to extract the wounded. The soldiers around us look grave and weary. Eventually, some Bradley fighting vehicles start pounding the building with mean 25 millimeter shells. Whoever might have been shooting from the upper stories is either dead or gone. The street is now littered with overturned air conditioners, fans, and refrigerators, the consumer amulets of progress and domesticity. We've moved up to a point just across from the Target building. A store on the ground floor starts to burn, and the shopkeeper sobs into Akil's chest as his life savings goes up in smoke. The flames spread to some bushes in front of a house next door. Nearby, a cooler of sodas is spilled forlornly on the sidewalk. Further away, 2 civilians lie dead, caught in the crossfire. A soldier peeks out from the hatch of a Bradley and calls over to a journalist, "Can you grab me one of those Cokes?" So that's a little firefight in Baghdad. So the next little section I'll read you from is later on. And it's about going to visit, I'll give you the background story first. It's about going to visit this sheikh in Ramadi, who actually, it turns out, is very important in the Association of Muslim Scholars, which is an organization of all the, well, not all of, but many of the religious leaders of the Sunni mosques in central Baghdad. And it's an organization that the U.S. essentially refuses to negotiate with and is very much connected to the resistance, but is not, formally connected to them, to completely misrepresent the relationship, but to give you some sense of it. It's sort of like saying that they're the Sinn Féin to the resistance's IRA, except it's not that at all. Anyway, so there's this guy, we went and we tried to find that, we'd heard about this young sheikh, like the Sheikh of Ramadi. And sheikh just means leader. And so we finally found this guy. And what happened later is that the guy that I worked with, Akil, left Iraq in February. So I didn't work with him when I went back in over the summer. And then he went back in October, and he was driving from Amman back to Baghdad, and he was using Coalition Provisional Authority travel papers, and he was stopped at the border, and the Iraqi border police were like, this is very interesting. You have coalition papers, and you've been in England for several months. Come have a glass of tea with us. And they sort of interrogated him and took down his details, and they're like, okay, see you later, Ahmed. And so he drove off into the desert. And basically, when you drive from the border of Jordan into Iraq, it's about 5 or 6 hours at literally 95 to 100 miles an hour on this perfectly straight highway through totally empty desert. And then you get to this one little town called Rabat, and then you get to Ramadi. And somewhere in the middle of that, these guys stopped him. And they stopped his car, and they were like, "Are you Ahmed?" And he was like, "Yes." And they were like, "Get out of the car." And they're like, "We're going to have to blindfold you." And they kidnapped him. And they were like, "You're a British spy, and we're going to kill you. We're going to cut your head off because you're working with the enemy." And he was like, "No, I'm not. I was a translator for journalists. I married this Muslim woman who lives in England, blah, 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 blah." And he was naming all these names, trying to save his life. And they were like, he was naming these people he knew in Fallujah, these sheikhs and people like that. They were like, "Sorry, they're not in the game. That doesn't work." And then he named this guy Sheikh Latif. He was like, "I know Sheikh Latif from Ramadi." And they were like, "Oh, really? Like, you better not be bullshitting us, or we'll kill you." And they interrogated him about who this guy was, what his house was like, how many family members he had. And then the next day, this sheikh showed up. And they're like, "Do you recognize this guy?" And he was like, "Oh yeah, I recognize this guy." And so the resistance released Ahmed to Sheikh Latif. and Sheikh Latif got him to Baghdad. So anyway, this was about the first time that we met this guy, Sheikh Latif. We've been trying to find him, going out to Ramadi, trying to find this guy. On our first trip to find the Sheikh, the resistance killed 2 French contractors, and we got caught in the ensuing traffic jam. Akil's buddy Hassan, Akil, remember his real name is Ahmed. Akil's buddy Hassan, a taciturn shopkeeper from Adamiyah, is at the wheel of his minivan. We're playing a musical driving game that Iraqis call This Is Your Fate. With the car radio on, someone will announce, "The next song is your fate," and name someone else in the car. Whatever music follows is deciphered for its metaphorical meanings. Akil gets the first tune, a cloying globo-pop love song, perfect, since his future wife is psychologically torturing him by running hot, then cold, then hot. Eshelman, a friend of mine, journalist Rob Eshelman, Eshelman is next with a bad cover of American Woman, which fits since he just hooked up with a cute British lady, and an American aid worker he'd been flirting with had just cracked one of his ribs in a playful wrestling match. The words of the song, as you will recall, are "American Woman, Stay Away From Me." I get the James Bond theme song. Then, just before it's Hassan's turn, he says, "Watch, it'll be the weather." Instead, we hit traffic, never a good sign after dark in the middle of the Iraqi desert. Soon, cars in front of us are cutting across the scrubland along the highway, their headlight beams bouncing through columns of dust. Ahead on the road, soldiers are conducting some sort of sweep, occasionally popping illumination flares into the sky. The brilliant incandescence floats down on small parachutes to reveal a quick 5 or 6 second snapshot of the scene below. Somewhere further on are the 2 dead contractors. "Now you see the traffic freedom. Isn't it really great? I feel so lucky that you Americans are in my country," says Akil as we bounce into the desert past the U.S. soldiers. Heading out the next day, Rob Eshelman is somewhat testy. They whacked 2 honkies on the road yesterday, so let's just say, and we were right behind them, so let's just say I'm a little bit edgy, okay? When we are finally arrived back in Ramadi, Akil has to stop for smokes. Waiting on the street for him, we hear a loud, close bang. A speeding pickup truck has just bottomed out in a rut and a few yards away. It tears past at lightning speed. Then the driver slams on the brakes to take a sharp left a few blocks down. In the truck's bed is an Ali Baba or resistance fighter with a headscarf wrapped around his face, a Kalashnikov in one hand while the other grips the side of the vehicle for dear life. In hot pursuit comes a police car, both officers waving guns out the window. "Welcome to Ramadi," says Rob with a mock grin. We drive all over town and see no American patrols. Muhammad Mahmoud Latif is a religious sheikh. Muhammad Mahmoud Latif is a leading religious sheikh in Ramadi. He's a member of the powerful Dulaimi clan. Tall and regal, he wears a long gray distasha and the red-checked headscarf common among the Al-Anbar tribes. Only 38 years old, the sheikh is already a venerated scholar and mediator with a PhD in religious studies. He is president of the religious sanctum of Anbar, a community of scholars associated with Ramadi's main mosque, and he is president of the Department of Quranic Studies at Anbar at Anbar College. As a religious sheikh or leader, Dr. Latif's status is scholarly and ecclesiastic. He is not a tribal sheikh. His status does not flow simply from holding a place of prominence in a powerful and politically connected family, nor is his status the product of being rich or good at business. In fact, his home is surprisingly modest. The majority of people in Al-Anbar, regardless of their occupation, are still connected to the old rhythms of the desert or the agricultural villages along the Euphrates, which bends through here. Like Fallujah, Ramadi is an old trading center, very religious, with complicated local politics. It is one of those backwaters, like rural Maine or parts of the U.S. South, that for insiders feels like the center of the universe, distinct and better from those soft places outside and beyond. But to a visitor, Ramadi feels isolated. The sheikh bears all the local Bedouin pride, but also exudes a worldliness and intellectual sophistication that clashes with the dusty provincialism of Ramadi's sand-colored homes and quiet streets. On the way in, Akil turned around from the front seat of Hassan's van and explains, "With a guy like this, you don't really ask many questions. It's more about letting him talk and just listening." When we meet Sheikh Latif the second time, he ushers us into his diwan, which is like the sort of the sitting room where people who are not from the home can come into the home, and introduces us to his brother and a cousin. Then he begins to explain the situation: sporadic electricity and water, no work, no reconstruction, poorly funded schools, hospitals with no medicines. As we meet, there is no electricity or water in his neighborhood. His younger brother has to bring water from a neighbor's house so that we can wash and to make chai. The diwan is cold and dark. The sheikh apologizes for the dry tap and cold, dim room, illuminated only through a vine-covered front window. The money of my country is still only in a few hands, and is still used only to pay spies and servants, explains the sheikh. The Americans are freak people. They try to insult us. They don't know anything about our way of life or how to treat people. They don't know how to treat Iraqis, says the sheikh in a tone of genuine concern. The sheikh is calm, articulate, focused. He is a man with intense personal charisma. They cover their faces with black masks and walk into homes and mosques in their boots. They urinate on mosques. They uncover and touch and insult Iraqi women. For our people, for a good Muslim man, he would rather die than allow a U.S. soldier into his bedroom with his wife half naked. The U.S. troops had searched the sheikh's home over the summer, and along with rifling through his books and personal quarters, they had seized his computer. Echoing a turn of phrase I'd heard elsewhere, he adds, "The American soldiers are acting like monsters." The sheikh says that when the Americans search a home, they immediately go for the books, and he gestures to his own books. They throw them all on the floor. Even the Holy Quran. They seem to know nothing about us. They can't even tell the Quran from other books. The aesthetics of Islam, particularly Sunni Islam, do not typically represent God and the cast of spiritual notables in the visual way most Christian faiths do, with the cross, images of Jesus, Mary, the saints, and stories from the Bible. Instead, the Quran, the word of God as told to the Prophet Muhammad, becomes the representation of God. Thus, the attention to and decoration of words and verses within the culture of Islam. In an abstract way, the Quran even embodies God. This reverence for words, both spoken and written, has its deepest roots in the poetic traditions of the Bedouins. Though Christians revere the Bible, Islam imbues the physical form and object qualities of the Quran with a different, more intense political, spiritual, and aesthetic significance that is not fully captured by the simple equation of Quran equals Bible. It is this complex relationship to the book and its scholarly tradition that now animates the sheikh. They kick the Holy Quran. They rip its pages and throw it to the ground. That means they do not respect Islam, they do not respect us, and they do not respect our culture. So, that's a section of sort of the point of view from Iraqis. So I could either read you more or I can answer questions. I completely lose track of time when I read these things because I'm actually, even though I'm an author and make my living this way, I don't feel particularly comfortable in front of large groups of people, so I have no idea whether it's 5 minutes or 20 minutes. So maybe I should take questions, yeah.
I'm covering this for the Sounds newspaper. My name is Joseph Riley. I go to Southeast Sound. You always hear in the media, of course, over here they try to inject the element of fear, around here to sort of, because it sells or whatever. But you do hear a lot about journalists who are abducted, and did that ever come into your mind when you went over there? And if so, how were you able to muster up the courage, and how did that pan out when you were actually in a situation where the shit hit the fan, so to speak?
Yeah, that was a constant issue, and I know people who were abducted. Several friends of mine have been kidnapped, and it's a major concern. It's the major concern. And then when we were hanging out with the sheikh, there was this one time he took us to meet these people, and then he wanted us to come back to eat with him, and he actually said, "I'm going to take one of the journalists hostage," and he was just joking, and Akil was like, he wanted me. And Akil was like, no, take Rob Eshelman. But yeah, no, it's a constant concern. And it's gotten really, really bad. It got really bad in April with the siege of Fallujah. And then, so it was bad over the summer. And the last time I was there, the way we dealt with it was I stayed with Dar Jamail, who hopefully many of you know, read his stuff online. He's an excellent journalist and a good friend of mine. And we stayed together in a hotel, and we're just like tried to be really, really low key and inconspicuous. But all the contractors by that point were doing the same thing. So, and then with the kidnapping of Simona Pari and Simona Toretti, who were people that I knew and hung out with, and they worked with Bridges to Baghdad, which is a anti-war Italian Italian NGO, that really escalated things. And then the kidnapping of Margaret Hassan and her murder was another very serious escalation. And the fact of the matter, according to the colleagues of the Simonas, who I met with their essentially immediate supervisor recently in London, and they were kidnapped by the resistance. They were not kidnapped by Negroponte and the CIA, as was speculated by some. There might have been some way behind the scenes manipulation of the group, but they were kidnapped by a Salafi, which is to say, like, fundamentalist Sunni resistance group of Iraqis, and that's who kidnapped them. And that was a pretty serious escalation. So it's really, really, really dangerous. And a lot of journalists, I mean, Dar is, I mean, I love him like a brother, but I mean, he's borderline nuts for what he does now. It's like, but also a lot of what he does, a lot of what any journalist who's there now does is it has to be like point A to point B. Like you get fixers set up an interview and you go to that interview and then you immediately go back to a fortified hotel. Or as much as possible, people are brought to hotels because the fear of kidnapping is really, really intense.
One thing about, you said something about the CIA. What CIA stages kidnaps or what I don't know, kidnappings or what?
No, I said there was speculation. I don't know if you read it, but there were some articles that speculated that when the Simonas were kidnapped, that it wasn't the resistance, that it was perhaps some sort of covert dirty tricks operation. And part of why people assume this was because the new ambassador to Iraq is John Negroponte, and he was ambassador to Honduras during the 80s, and he was connected to the creation and training of a death squad within the Honduran military called Battalion 318. So people were like, this kind of reeks of Negroponte's dirty tricks. But I mean, and maybe at some level it was, but the fact of the matter is, like, the people who kidnapped, the group that kidnapped the Simonas were resistance. So yeah, it's really, really dangerous. Yeah, and it's scary, and I'm not, I didn't like that part of it.
Thanks.
Yes.
I'm in a mass communications class, and I was wondering, as a journalist being over there, how do you feel that the media is presenting it to us over here?
Well, I think the coverage is really bad. In one way, the coverage is bad in its framing, and it's not so much, the reporting isn't always very good, but in a weird way, that's not the worst of it, because there's an element, there's an aspect in which the New York Times actually reports all of the key facts. But here's an example, like Haifa Street, which you may have heard of, is essentially the center of Baghdad, and it's right in front of the green zone. And one day I was reading the New York Times, and there was a line buried in an article about Haifa Street now considered a no-go area for U.S. troops, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, what? It's like, that's like literally the front door of the green zone. And this is where, what was it, 2 weeks ago, the resistance set up a checkpoint, set up a traffic stop for a half an hour with 30 men until they caught election workers and then executed them in front of cameras. This is like right in front of the green zone. So those facts are in the newspaper. But the problem with the coverage is no one is like, hey, time out, check it out, man. What the fuck does that mean? Like essentially, like the Fifth Avenue of Baghdad is out of control. Like the space literally right in front of the green zone. can be, yeah, Pennsylvania Avenue, essentially, of Baghdad is under the control of the resistance, that they walk around without masks on, checking cars, checking people's documents, and then when they find election workers, they cap them in broad daylight. And no one's like, what does this mean? Shouldn't we like have a series of editorials about this and contemplate the implications? Like, what conclusions do we draw from this fact? The fact is there. It's in the story, and then you move on. And it's like, so the main problem with the reporting is the contextualization of the facts. But then there are also lots and lots of facts that are left out and spun poorly and all that. But that, I think, is the main problem. Yes?
What do you see as your role as an author and your responsibility?
Well, I don't know in terms of my responsibility or whatever, but what I was trying to do with this book is to address people's political imagination and emotions, because I've done enough analytical writing, enough reporting, sort of different genres, and I think that the left is very, very good at investigative journalism and at analysis, and that there's a genre or a set of genres that are dominated by the center-right primarily, that captivate through good writing and experience and drama people's emotions and political imagination. So that's what I tried to do with this book. Was not like make yet another case against the war and explain blah, 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 blah. In the introduction, I say, look, there's tons of books explaining why this happened, why it's wrong. You actually don't even have to consult the left to understand this. You can just read basically the administration's own publications, and they'll tell you why they did this. So what I tried to do here was make people, hopefully in some small way, feel connected and inspired by presenting a narrative that was more narrative in its form. In the back there?
How much, if any, flack have you gotten for writing that book?
I haven't gotten really any flack. What happens when you write from the left, people rarely give you flack, they just ignore you. That's what happens. It's like you just don't get reviewed. And you can sell as much as the mainstream book on the same subject, and you just won't get reviewed. The New York Times book review, whoever, just ignore you. That's the way to deal with it. Yes?
You're talking about center-right having that genre down. I'm thinking of like Robert Kaplan.
Yeah, he's not even so
Left-wing
center.
Robert Kaplan.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know how to take that, but yeah, no, I think you're totally right. I think Kaplan is a perfect example. And to some extent, what in a weird way motivated me to write this was in part, just a feeling of exhaustion of like doing this like analytical stuff. The last two books I did were very kind of like detailed, historical, analytical books that I felt were completely watertight. But what does it matter ultimately? And Kaplan, I remember the impact that Kaplan's article from I think it was 19, well, yeah, was that 82? Was that 92 or 94?
92, I think.
Yeah, that was like a shockwave throughout the chattering classes, left, right, and center. And people, without wanting it to be so, were like, the impact was amazing. People were like, wow, man, the world is falling apart. And though they didn't say it, many liberals, even many lefties, were kind of like, wow, this is really scary. And maybe U.S. empire really is the only thing going. And it was just an utterly manipulative, like really, really effective way to write, but it was just utterly manipulative. He never really came right out and said that. He just like told you this story about like this, compelling narrative of like these like crazy, diseased savages out there all of them wielding AK-47s, and like there's this government here that we all know is corrupt and stupid in D.C. And he's got all the liberal critiques to make you feel like he's an outsider, but he's like the insider's outsider. But the punchline of the story is that like emotionally you're left feeling like, holy moly, man, the world is completely out of control, and the only thing protecting me is the U.S. state. This is an extremely manipulative, extremely effective genre, and the left doesn't do that enough. So that's sort of, I mean, not to be pretentious, I wasn't trying to be Robert Kaplan, but I was like, that's effective. If they do it, maybe we should do it.
I had a specific question, which was back to the mainstream media issue. I was wondering about perceptible differences between some of the mainstream media. For example, a good friend of mine is Anthony Shadid. Kind of a rising star with the Washington Post now.
Oh yeah, well he's just won the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, and I'm sort of curious, in your book you have that one part where you talk about crossing paths with his partner at the Post, I can't remember.
Rajiv.
And you mentioned that he seems like a decent person and so on. I'm wondering if you think, like comparing the New York Times and Washington Post. See, I've been going to the Post now because I know Anthony, or Tony. So I'm just curious, what's your take on that?
Well, I think he deserved that Pulitzer Prize, and I think that it shows completely that the Washington Post's reporting on Iraq is so much better than the New York Times.
That's my sense.
It's so much better, and it's like the style of their writing is completely different. It's almost like, it's much more like English journalism. It like their leads almost have a thesis in them, and yeah, it's much better. They would be, to get back to the Haifa Street example, just, I don't know how they framed that, but the Washington Post would be more likely to be like, bad things went down on Haifa Street today, and that means that stuff is really out of control. Like they would say that right up front. They wouldn't just like tell you that Haifa Street was out of control and not tell you what that means. But of course, the Washington Post editorially and all that is still online with like, we got to win this, blah, 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 blah. But some of their reporters there are really, really good. And I don't subscribe to that Robert Fisk thing. He's like, oh, no one gets out of their hotels and blah, 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 blah. I'm the only journalist who ever gets anywhere. That's really like bullshit. There are a lot of good journalists, and there are a lot of good journalists who work for the mainstream too. And they don't always get to write what they want because their editors don't allow them. For example, a friend of mine went out to dinner with Dexter Filkins, someone you might know, Doug Henwood. He's a good friend of mine, economic journalist. He went out to dinner with Dexter Filkins. I don't know how they ended up out to dinner, and he was sort of interrogating Dexter Filkins, and Dexter Filkins, who writes for the New York Times, was like, oh yeah. He was like, the place is completely out of control. It's totally hopeless, melted down, it's lost, forget it. And then you read what Dexter Filkins wrote from Fallujah, and it's like a John Wayne movie, So there are a lot of journalists who know better, but like if you really want to like get along and have a really great job at the New York Times, you don't write things like that. Or someone edits it out if you do. Yes?
I've met a few people traveling that were, in a lot of cases, younger folks like that managed to get some kind of freelance gigs with like AP or whatnot, like, and kind of were able to support like a kind of activist journalist lifestyle, mildly that way. I just wonder what you think about like that as like a reality for people who want to get more active, like outside of their homes, and involved in the world of press and writing about it, Would that like really, you know what I'm saying? What do you see as like valid entry points for people who are trying to do that, how to like sustain themselves through their life?
Well, that's how Dar did it. I mean, Dar is, he got into journalism very recently just by going to Iraq. He was a mountain paramedic in Alaska. And he's from actually a right-wing Christian Lebanese family in Texas, and was a mountain paramedic in Alaska, and somehow wanted to be a journalist and went to Iraq, and did it on his own dime at first, and then like got, was working the internet and people were supporting him, and then would do these speaking tours and has raised his own money to go back. So people do that. That's possible to do. There's a guy who's now like the Times bureau chief in Baghdad, who spends most of his time, I think, locked down in the Palestine, pretty much all of it. But he started out that way. It's like, raising money, like, I'm the young guy who wants to go report the truth. And then once he got there, started pitching things to Time, and everybody, at a certain point, everybody was, had bugged out, because it's like, it is really, really dangerous in Iraq. I mean, you can't leave Baghdad. It's just totally, I mean, and even traveling around Baghdad now is utterly insane. And so older journalists, you know, go count coup, and then at a certain point you're like, you know, what am I trying to prove? What is this? This is insane. So a young guy like that can become bureau chief for time. But yeah, so it's possible to do, and some people sell out doing it. But yeah, it's definitely possible to do, and it's important for people to do. It's important. There's you know, there's more stories in Iraq. The whole world is full of interesting stories, and you know, people should be going all over the place, going to Asia and Latin America and everywhere, and trying to report that way. So I think it's possible. Yes.
I was wondering if you could take some time to illuminate what you see as some of the possibilities are for resolution or a way to rectify the situation in Iraq right now.
And also the Iraqi perceptions of those.
Yeah.
The Iraqi perceptions of?
The possibilities for a solution as well as your own.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I think that the Iraqi perceptions for resolution are in some ways very unrealistic. From what I heard from Iraqis, there was a lot of hopeful naivete, like all throughout. I would hear, like, even during the June 28th handover, a lot of people were like, well, wow, at least now the Americans will leave the cities. I remember hearing this again and again. I'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, why do you think they're going to leave the cities? Like, what on earth makes you think that they're going to leave the cities or leave Iraq or leave the region? So there's a lot of like hopeful, like wishful thinking among Iraqis. And you find it in the resistance too. And I interviewed them. I was like, so what's your plan? And the fact of the matter is that political Islam really doesn't have a plan for how you organize society. It's a series of religious anti-imperialist slogans. And I asked the resistance, you know, so what do you want for Iraq? They'd be like, we want a religious government, we want an Islamic government that's not run by thieves, that will serve the people. And it's like, so what's that exactly? How do you? And there was nothing really more specific than that. In terms of solutions, I could tell you like how it could happen, but it's not going to happen that way. How it could happen is that the U.S. is like, okay, we screwed up, we'll pull out. We're going to like knock heads together, have a regional, you know, convention, get everybody else who's involved, which is to say Turkey, Syria, Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Everyone has to sit down. Everyone's got to agree to stop doing this. There has to be massive reparations paid to Iraq. There has to be the political space made for the parties within Iraq to hash out some sort of federal government, which they could do. I mean, I think Iraqi forces are, you know, political leaders are completely willing to do that. But the pot is being stirred by external intervention, not just U.S. intervention. You know, so you could do that, and then there could be some sort of slow, sort of like removal of all these forces and massive funding, you know, of reparations from the U.S. And there could be some sort of tripartite federal government created that would be a religious government, and it would probably be anti-American. But that's not going to happen because the U.S. is run by a bunch of fanatics who will not give up. Who will not let go of Iraq. And so really what I think is going to happen, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think it's going to be really, really ugly, really ugly. And I don't think there's a happy ending to the story. And I think it's really important for the left to not condition its demands for withdrawal of U.S. troops on there being a happy ending. That it's not like, well, we broke it, now we own it, we got to do something. No. It's like maybe Iraq is a failed state. Maybe it's that bad. You know, maybe that's what the U.S. did, and the U.S. has to leave because all it's doing is escalating. And when the U.S. leaves, people are like, well, what happens when the U.S. leaves? Well, maybe there is a civil war. You know, maybe that is what is going to happen.
Maybe that's what they need.
What?
Maybe that's what they need.
No one needs a civil war. That's not what they need. But that's what might happen. You know, but the fact of the matter is the U.S. is not. I mean, look what are the papers reporting yesterday? They're contemplating the Salvador solution. It's insane, you know? It's totally insane what the U.S. is doing. They're escalating. They've leveled Fallujah, and there's no discussion of it. It's like there's no hope for the U.S. playing a positive role in Iraq. And the fact of the matter is the situation there is really, really like just poisoned and chaotic and so violent, and forces have been unleashed that cannot be put back in a bottle, and that's the way it really is.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Do you see Christian religious fundamentalism playing kind of an intractable demand role in this?
No, not really, but maybe that's because I'm not paying enough attention to that. I mean, I know that Ron Suskind article in the New York Times animated everybody's imagination, and I suppose I sort of feel like, oh, I should be taking American Christian fundamentalism more seriously, but it's this kind of thing that, like, you know, coming up during the Reagan era as a youth and adolescent, it was always like, oh yeah, the Christian boogeyman, I'm so scared of it. And you just, like, you know, one's experience of America is that Americans are essentially too hedonistic, too self-centered, and too lazy to ever be like religious fundamentalists. So it's kind of hard for me to take that really, really seriously. I know that the Bush administration is imbued with that. I know Bush is a religious fundamentalist, but it's like, I think the main thing is not that exotic. That the main thing is just American imperialism, that they want to control the planet. They have the Soviet Union collapsed. They have this opening. The right wing saw Clinton's humanitarian interventionism and alliance building as a method of controlling the globe as being too soft, that what they needed was this, you know, direct approach demonstration effect, like, and go in and take the oil upon which Europe and Asia are dependent, situate the U.S. militarily in key regions so that everybody else is dependent on it, and just lock it down, lock the planet down for the next 50 years. And if that has nothing to do with, like, beliefs in God and redemption, all that sort of stuff, I think that's the main thing. And that's when you hear people like John Kerry. He's not a religious fundamentalist, but he says, he's like, we can't lose, we can't afford to lose it. I don't think he's, like, lying. I think he really believes that. He wasn't going to leave if he'd won. Or just that they're an element within the project. The fundamentalists are there, and they're an element within it. But it's the American, you know, corporate class, ruling class, are like, they're committed to running the planet directly and indirectly, and they understand that the Middle East, with all its oil, is important to control. Not so much to own the oil and sell it, but to, like, be the petroleum gendarme, to be the force that secures the oil supply upon which everybody is dependent, because then that creates all sorts of subtle, indirect types of dependencies that play out, for example, in something like there's new toxic standards that are being promulgated by the EU, right, on, like, how chemicals should be made and used, and they're different from the US standard. Currently, the global standard is the US standard. The EU has a bigger market. There's this question, which way is the world going to go in the production and consumption and use of chemicals? Who do they follow? You know, if the US is the indispensable military umbrella for everybody, it helps in questions like that. And there's an infinite number of questions like that, each one of which is insignificant in and of itself, but all of which, you add it up, equal global control. Yes?
Can you describe being embedded with US troops?
Well, I was embedded with reservists, from the Florida National Guard, who were in Baghdad, and one of whom has become a pretty good friend of mine. I hooked him up with a book contract. His name is John Crawford, and his book's probably going to be out in the fall. I think it's going to be called My Last True Story. And you know, that was pretty. They're just, you know, regular Americans in a difficult situation. Then I was embedded with the 82nd Airborne in Fallujah, and the main thing, I guess, that I was interested in when I was embedded with them, along with seeing the war from their perspective, was trying to figure out how they understood it and to see if there was any. I guess when I went there, I was hoping that I would find, actually, long story short, is that I remembered this thing I saw on television when I was a kid called The World of Charlie Company, CBS World Reports, and I convinced Garrett to come with me. I was like, dude, you should make the next World of Charlie Company. And so our plan was to embed with these guys from Florida National Guard and make a movie about them, because this documentary, The World of Charlie Company, was made in 1971 in Vietnam with this unit of draftees who were, like, completely not into the war. And it had it's since been lost and forgotten, but it had a huge splash politically. even in the war on drugs, because there were these scenes of them smoking weed through the barrels of their M16s. They captured a combat refusal, which is essentially a mutiny, on film, which is a capital offense. Like if you're a soldier and you're in combat and an officer tells you to do something and you don't do it, you can be shot and killed by the officer. And this officer tells them to go down a road, to not go down the side of the road, and on film these guys are like, nah, we're not going to do it. So I was sort of hoping to find that, but that's not what I found in Iraq. They're much more like, American soldiers are like pretty damn disciplined and very cynical. They might hate the war. They might even have a pretty sophisticated critique of the war, but it's not a drafty army. It's a professional army, and that's created a very different culture. And there are these like rebellions happening, but so far I just don't think that so far people are still hanging in there doing their jobs.
Do you follow your stories through the communication channels of the military, or do you have your own cell phone? How do you file your stories?
Well, I filed my stories afterwards, much afterwards, and I wasn't like doing newspaper stuff.
Right.
So I mean, I was mostly doing research for the book, and then I filed like one story from each embed. So it was like, there was no pressure of that stuff, like clearing events, and that's what I think. I mean, the reason what I was looking when I embedded wasn't news. It was culture, was ethnography, and it'd be different if I was like trying to report on this or that operation.
Did you find any understanding among the soldiers of human rights law, of Geneva Conventions, that they're not actually supposed to turn off the water to a city that's under siege or fire ambulances, say? Is that anything? Is it on their minds at all? Is there an awareness of that?
Yeah, there is, and I mean, I was never in any operation that was that intense, like the siege of Fallujah. So the water was always on, and they were always on their best behavior with that sort of stuff. And their feeling is that their hands are tied. They're like all these people are guilty, man. It's like, who just shot at us? It's like this guy, all these people. So we should just round them all up. And a lot of them are like, we should just blow this place to smithereens. We should nuke this whole country. I would hear that time and time again. Be like, yeah, this is about oil. It's about contracts. It's about George Bush bailing out like Dick Cheney and Halliburton, and everyone were totally corrupt and a bunch of crooks. And I hate Hajis, and I think what we should do is just fucking nuke this country and take their oil. And be like, wait a minute, but you just had this like whole essentially like anti-imperialist critique. Like how do you get to like nuke Iraq? But like, so that I can get back home and like drive my own car and eat at Outback Steakhouse. That was often the attitude.
Two quick questions. One was, if in the hypothetical resolution stage of years to come from now or whatever, do you think the U.S. will have a hand in whether or not it's a secular society or controlled secularly or non-secular, or?
I don't think it's going to be a secular society. This is one thing maybe to just disabuse you all of. It's like this whole idea that there's something secular in Iraq. There's nothing secular in Iraq. There's no secular in Iraq. There are like a few tiny little fringe parties that are like socialist or whatever. There's one, the Iraqi Workers' Communist Party. There's the Communist Party of Iraq, which has collaborated with the occupation in the hopes that it could change the nature of the occupation, but in fact the inverse happened, and they were changed by the occupation. And even the Communist Party is very close to, very open to religion. They're a secular party, but people talk about like Saddam Hussein being a secular leader. People think that means he was somehow not religious, or that the Ba'ath Party was not religious. That's not true. The Ba'ath Party always rooted its version of Arab socialism, which was a completely nebulous concept, which basically meant kind of like third world command economy with plenty of like private sector space left in it. They would always rhetorically root that in Islam. And what it meant was that, you could be Shia, you could be Christian, you could be Sunni, you could be Sufi, and you could still be in the Ba'ath Party. And there were all those people in the Ba'ath Party. It meant essentially secularism to the Ba'ath Party meant a pluralistic approach to religion. But the Ba'ath Party was not anti-religious. And Iraq is a very, very, very religious culture. So it's going to be religious in the future. Yeah, this lady in the back.
what do you see as the likelihood of implementing the Salvador solution, and what do you think the result would be there?
Well, I think they probably, I mean, this is pure speculation, which I try to stay away from, but I imagine that they're already doing it. I mean, there's been a strange wave of assassinations against Ba'athist intellectuals ever since the invasion was over. Now, some of that is just payback. I remember I interviewed a guy, I didn't put it in the book or write it up anywhere because I couldn't quite confirm what he said, but this guy was a medical student and the director of the medical faculty at Baghdad University had screwed him over and gotten him imprisoned and had screwed over a bunch of students. And so when the invasion happened and law and order ended, a bunch of students armed themselves. Guns, the country's totally awash in guns. Everybody's allowed to own guns. So they armed themselves, they rolled up to his house, and they rang his doorbell, and they were like, "Professor so-and-so?" and blew him away for personal reasons. And he was a Ba'athist intellectual that died. And so there's a whole bunch of, apparatchik Ba'athist intellectual official types who've bit the dust. Some of it's just payback. Some of it might be trying to eliminate a class of people who could help provide organization and coherence to an anti-American movement. I mean, I don't know. I have no proof that it's happening. So I don't know. But I'll tell you this much. If I was John Negroponte and I believed in the cause, that's what I would do. I would go around and kill the Association of Muslim Clerics. I would try and wipe them all out. If I was John Negroponte, if I really thought that they were all evil and that America was the greatest thing in the world, why not? What would be the restraint? And what would the effect be? Probably nothing. I mean, it's hopeless. I think the U.S. project there is totally hopeless. They completely lost it. The way they had a moment in which they could do it, and that was the first months after the invasion, and the way to do it would have been to co-opt the Iraqi army, to throw huge amounts of money at the local Iraqi elite, to pull in foreign firms from everywhere with U.S. tax money, and in exchange for those contracts, get lots and lots of soldiers from poor countries ranging from Bulgaria to Bangladesh, and to do things essentially completely differently than they did, to immediately hold an election, all sorts of stuff that they didn't do because the project was run by a bunch of ideologues who were high as a kite on 10 to 15 years of total victory. They had the first Gulf War, they had, maybe it's even longer, maybe it's 20 years of victory, right? They had Grenada, then they basically kept the lid on Central America, they rolled back socialism in Central America, they won the first Gulf War, the Soviet Union fell, they managed the crisis in Yugoslavia perfectly, they left that whole thing to boil until the Europeans were essentially we can't handle this on our own, please come be the solution. The U.S. was the solution there. Then they did Afghanistan, everyone was like, you're insane, what part of Afghanistan don't you understand? Rolled through, did Afghanistan. So they were so high. And it's a classic situation. This is how all great wars start. Certain elites get to the point where they can no longer think rationally, and then they just overreach. And that's what they did in Iraq. That's what the southern elites did in the U.S. The reason the southern elites attacked the North and tried to secede was because they knew, it was obvious to them, that the North was a decrepit, pathetic society that couldn't fight back. And that's why they seceded. And instead, they got their asses handed to them. And the same with the Germans and the French when they went to war during World War I. Both sides were like, oh, this is a rematch of the Franco-Prussian War. And this time, we've got it all locked down. We're going to wipe them out. And it was like they were wrong. So that's what happened. They were so high on ideology that they didn't think rationally. They didn't make any concessions to anyone. And they were greedy, and they allowed Halliburton and Bechtel to take all the money rather than invest it. They were high on this idea of purifying the society, remaking the whole Middle East, all this just patently insane stuff that everybody, even the State Department, was telling them this is crazy, and they did it anyway. So,
and yet they're rhetorical masters, and we live amongst many that buy it lock, stock, and barrel, however they want to frame the story. And news blurbs coming out, Democracy Now! Just spent a lot of time today talking about how they're manipulating news and constructing stories. So since the election here, there's been a lot of talk amongst the left about how to approach the conversation, the dialogue, Lakoff, and the whole thing about how do you talk to the right and all of that. You talked about the narrative structure of your book and how one of the things that does for us is gives us another way to approach the conversation besides just trying to prove the facts of the war and how we've been misled. With that in mind, could you speak a little bit to how do we approach that conversation? How do we go down the street? We've got 6,000 vets plus now already back from the war amongst us as we go out into the community trying to talk about the war and trying to shift the dialogue. But we've got this rhetoric coming. So how do we approach that conversation?
Well, one easy thing is, what I always do in dealing with people who are really pro-military, pro-vet, is immediately just break off the civilians from the military. And just be clear, like, I'm not talking about the U.S. military. And then, which is easy to do because it's true, then you just make this critique of the civilian side of the occupation. And be like, and it's you guys, the vets, who are left holding the bag, because these people totally screwed up and gave all of this money, all this tax money, to these corrupt firms, Halliburton and Bechtel, which according to the laws at the time shouldn't have even gotten these contracts because they'd been convicted of fraud, but the Bush administration changed the rules so they could, and then they did nothing with it, and now young GIs are trying to keep a lid on this. So I think that's one way to do it, just to separate the politics from the military. Because people in this culture have, let's face it, a really deeply nationalistic, militaristic, weird, almost irrational fixation with the importance of the military in being American. And that's something that shouldn't be part of our culture and that we should address. But more immediately, in terms of making arguments about this war, one does not have to necessarily confront that. And it's a little bit risky, one doesn't want to fall into this, bring the troops home at any cost, because I could be like, yeah, so nuke them and then bring the troops home. But there is a way in which you can allow people that fixation and then say, okay, but could you focus on these other questions for a moment? And then what happens often is people start seeing stuff that they never saw before. And they see that the society they live in is run by a bunch of crooks and liars. And they don't have to necessarily not be proud of the Purple Heart and the blah 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 and the uncle who died and Nam and all that sort of stuff, just because they see that the society is run by crooks. So that would be one strategy, I'd say. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference between writing a book like Soft Cage, where it's more academic and more in-depth research, as opposed to the freedom and just how did you go about starting that? Were you just I'll just go to Iraq and see what happens and write it down, or what's sort of the different process and the sort of journalistic as opposed to the academic research text?
Well, the Soft Cage took 3 years to write, and it was very sort of scholarly. I like to think it's not that academic, so I like to think it's readable, but it was, this book came about sort of because I went there the first time, and then I wrote an article about embedding with these disgruntled GIs who were. And I left a lot of stuff out of that article. I left the stuff out about, tag teaming prostitutes and everybody being high on Valium and juicing on steroids and all that sort of stuff, because, and that was a form of censorship that I did, self-censorship. And I did that because these guys would have been in really, really deep shit had I said that about them. And they had been nice to me, and I'd been out on patrol with them, and I wasn't going to do that to them. So, but anyway, I wrote about some other stuff that people thought was interesting, and their officers thought was outrageous, and they tried to blacklist me and all that sort of stuff. And in response to that article, people were just like, will you write a book? Will you write a book? A bunch of publishers came to me asking me to write a book, and I was like, maybe. So then I went back, and I was already interested. So that's how. And it was also I was just it was what I was talking about before, this thing I'd always wanted to do, sort of like use that different style, that narrative style that I found so effective, or saw as being so effective when other people used it. So it was just, it's very different. One was based on experience, and one was based on, you know, a lot of time in the archives and arguments, you know, so, and in a way it was like, this book was much more cathartic, much more fun to write, and it's sort of, I felt like I had paid my dues. I'd written these two other deeply researched, very like complexly argumented books that sometimes people got, sometimes people didn't. Like, I mean, both of those books, sometimes Lockdown America, people still don't get the argument. You know, they think that like, they're like, yeah, whatever. I don't want to get into that, but it's like people don't get the argument in that book, and so I just wanted to write something that was more visceral, so I did it.
Have you gotten any criticism for having a more narrative, something that's maybe more personal?
No. Maybe I will, but I haven't.
When you're confronted with that kind of self-censorship, where there are things happening to the troops that you don't want to write.
I eventually put it in the book, though.
Did you?
For the
I mean,
record.
my question was, would you ever consider writing under a pseudonym, or how did you approach actually putting it in the book eventually?
I just put it in the book. I just put it as it was in the book. Because at that point, I knew by the time this book came out, they would be away. They'd be out of there. So I just put it all in the book. And the only thing I did in the book was like, there's certain guys who were like, you know, like married and stuff, and I was like, my little wives, and I was like, just a little bit vague, so that if anybody's wife was like, so wait a minute, like 4 of you guys fucked a 17-year-old prostitute? Like what? That they go, no, my name's not in there. It was just some guys from the unit did that. You know? So I did a little bit of masking like that for the sake of these guys who. And then I ended the book by going back and visiting these guys in Florida, who I had embedded with. So, but I wouldn't write under a pseudonym. And there were other things that, you know, I mean, the things like, I mean, when I wrote it, I wasn't clear that they were. I didn't check it with them. I, in fact, expected them to be kind of pissed off by some of what I wrote about the soldiers, but they all kind of liked it. So. All right, so maybe we should wrap it up unless there's one last question. No last question. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming out. And. Sign books if anybody wants to buy them. Steal them. This is like right in front of the green zone. So those facts are in the newspaper. But the problem with the coverage is no one is like, hey, time out, check it out, man. What the fuck does that mean? Like essentially, like the Fifth Avenue of Baghdad is out of control. Like the space literally right in front of the green zone.
Pennsylvania Avenue.
Can be, yeah, Pennsylvania Avenue essentially of Baghdad is under the control of the resistance, that they walk around without masks on, checking cars, checking people's documents, and then when they find election workers, they cap them in broad daylight. And no one's like, what does this mean? Shouldn't we like have a series of editorials about this and contemplate the implications? Like, what conclusions do we draw from this fact? The fact is there.
What do you see is your role as an author and your responsibility?
The war and explain blah, 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 blah. And in the introduction, I say, look, you know, there are tons of books explaining why this happened, why it's wrong. You know, you actually don't even have to consult the left to understand this. You can just read basically the administration's own publications and they'll tell you why they did this. So what I tried to do here was make people, hopefully in some small way, feel connected. And in the back.
How much, if any, flack have you gotten for writing that book?
I haven't gotten really any flack. You know, I mean,
You're talking about the center right having that genre down. I'm thinking of like Robert Kaplan.
yeah,
He's like left-wing Robert Kaplan.
Well,
I'm kidding.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, I'm kidding.
But yeah, no, I think you're totally. I think
Yeah.
Kaplan is a perfect example.
Yeah.
And what I mean, to some extent, was that 82? Was that 92 or 94?
92, I think.
Yeah, that was like a shockwave
Yeah.
throughout the chattering classes,
Yeah.
left, right, and center. And people, without wanting it to be so, were like, I mean, the impact was amazing. People were like, wow, man, the world is falling apart. And though they didn't say it, many liberals, even many lefties were kind of like, wow, this is really scary. And maybe U.S. empire really is the only thing going. And it was this utterly manipulative way to write, but it was just utterly manipulative. He never really came right out and said that. He just like told you this story about
Very
like
compelling
this,
narrative.
yeah, compelling narrative of like these like crazy.
Back to the mainstream media issue. I was wondering about perceptible differences between some of the mainstream media. For example, a good friend of mine is Anthony Shadid, who's kind of a rising star with the Washington Post now.
Oh yeah,
He just returned back. Yeah, I'm sort of curious, in your book you have that one part where you talk about crossing paths with his partner at the Post, I can't remember his name, Rajiv. And you mentioned that he seems like a decent person and so on. I'm wondering if you think, like comparing the New York Times and Washington Post. Yeah, I've been going to the Post now because I know Anthony, or Tony. So I'm just curious, what's your take on that?
Well, I think you deserve that whole surprise, and I think that it shows completely that the Washington Post, they would be, to get back to the Haifa Street example, just, you know, I don't know how they framed that, but the Washington Post would be more likely to be like, you know, bad things went down on Haifa Street today, and that means that stuff is really out of control. Like, they would say that right up front. They wouldn't just like tell you that Haifa Street was out of control and not tell you what that means. But of course, you know, the Washington Post editorially and all that is still online with like, we gotta win this, blah, 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 blah. But some of their reporters there are really, really good. And I don't subscribe to that Robert Fisk thing. He's like, oh, no one gets out of their hotels and blah, 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 blah. I'm the only journalist who ever gets anywhere. That's really like bullshit. There are a lot of good journalists. And there are a lot of good journalists who work for the mainstream too, or someone edits it out if you do.
I'm interested, I've met a few people traveling that were, you know, in a lot of cases, younger folks, like, that managed to get some kind of freelance gigs with, like, AP or whatnot, like, and kind of were able to support, like, a kind of activist journalist lifestyle, you know, mildly that way. I just wonder
what you think about like that as like a reality for people who want to get more active, like outside of their homes, you know, and involved in the world and crafts and writing about it, you know, without like really, you know what I'm saying? What do you see as like valid entry points for people trying to do that, how to like sustain themselves through their writing?
Well, that's how dark. I was wondering if you could take some time to illuminate what you see some of the possibilities are for resolution in your way to rectify the situation in Iraq.
And also the Iraqi perceptions of those.
The Iraqi perceptions of
The possibilities for a solution as well as your own.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I think that the Iraqi sort of like removal of all these forces and massive funding, you know, reparations from the U.S., and there could be some not let go of Iraq. And so really what I think is going to happen, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think it's going to be really, really ugly, really ugly. And I don't think there's a happy ending to the story. And I think it's really important for the left to not condition its demands for withdrawal of U.S. troops on there being a happy ending. That it's not like, well, we broke it, now we own it, we got to do something. No. It's like maybe Iraq is a failed state. Maybe it's that bad. You know, maybe that's what the U.S. did, and the U.S. has to leave because all it's doing is escalating. And when the U.S. leaves, people go, well, what happens when the U.S. leaves? Well, maybe there is a civil war. You know, maybe that is what is going to happen.
Maybe that's what they need.
What?
Maybe that's what they need.
No one needs a civil war. It's not what they need. But that's what might happen. You know, but the fact of the matter is the U.S. is not. I mean, look are the papers report?
Excuse me. Yeah. Do you see Christian religious fundamentalism playing an kind of an intractable demand role in this?
No, not really.
Who's the fundamentalists?
Or just that they're an element within the project. The fundamentals are there, and they're an element within it. But it's the American, you know, corporate class, ruling class, are like, they're committed to running the planet directly and indirectly, and they understand that the Middle East, with all its oil, is important to control. Not so much to own the oil and sell it, but to like be the petroleum gendarme, to be the. Yes.
Can you describe being embedded with U.S. troops?
Well, I was embedded with reservists, Florida. So far, I just don't think that.
Cell phone, how do you file your story?
Well, I filed my stories afterwards, my term events, and that's what I think.
Quick questions. One was, if in the hypothetical resolution stage of years to come from now or whatever, do you think the U.S. will have a hand in whether or not it's a secular society or controlled secularly or non-secular, or?
I don't think it's going to be a secular society. This is one thing.
What do you see as the likelihood of implementing the Salvador solution, and what do you think the result would be there?
Well, I think they probably. I mean.
And yet they're rhetorical masters. And we live amongst many that buy it lock, stock, and barrel, however they want to frame the story. And news blurs coming out. Democracy Now! We spent a lot of time today talking about how they're manipulating news and constructing stories. So since the election here, there's been a lot of talk amongst the left about how to approach the conversation, the dialogue, Lakoff, and the whole thing about how do you talk to the right and all of that. You talked about the narrative structure of your book and how one of the things that does for us is gives us another way to approach the conversation besides just trying to prove the facts of the war and how we've been misled. With that in mind, could you speak a little bit to how do we approach that conversation? How do we go down the street? We've got 6,000 vets plus now already back from the war amongst us as we go out into the community trying to talk about the war and trying to shift the dialogue. But we've got this rhetoric coming. So how do we approach that conversation?
Well, one easy thing is, what I was doing dealing with.
I mean, you could talk a little bit about the difference between writing a book like Soft Cage, where it's more academic and more in-depth research, as opposed to like the freedom and just like how did you go about starting that? Where you're just like, I'll just go to Iraq and see what happens and write it down, or what's sort of the different process and the sort of journalistic as opposed to the academic research text?
Well, I mean, the Soft Cage was
For having a more narrative, something that's maybe more personal.
No.
Self-censorship, where there are things happening with the troops that you don't want to write.
I eventually put it in the book.
My question was, would you ever consider writing under a pseudonym, or how did you approach actually putting it in the book eventually?
I just put it in the book. I just put it as it was in the book. Because at that... All right, so maybe we should wrap it up unless there's one last question. No last question. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming out. And signed books if anybody wants to buy them.